I'm about to cut my gray and yellow wrap off the rigid heddle loom, but before I do that, I wanted to talk about some issues, is the polite way to put it, issues that occurred as I was making this. And because for new weavers, especially, I think uh, you might get in the middle of a project and suddenly things start to go wrong, or at least not how you expected. And you need to know how to get around that because much of the time, I'm going to say 95% of the time, even when things don't go the way you expected on a weaving project, there are ways to correct these issues without losing the whole project. In other words, you can salvage 95% of the situations you get yourself into. And that is good for me to remember, even though I've been waiting for a really long time, because this project turned out to be a disaster. So I want to, not a disaster, it just didn't go the way I expected it to. And before I get all pessimistic and go, oh, this was a disaster, I better just cut it off and throw everything away and start over, I want to talk about types of problems. So there are design problems. In other words, the weaver, in this case me, didn't think enough about how I had envisioned the whole project and what I intended this woven fabric to be used for. So design problems can get in the way and lead to unexpected results. Then there are yarn choice problems. And I guess that's a subset of design. But again, I want you to think about them differently, um, just because especially as a new weaver, you might be thinking about adapting somebody else's pattern with your own yarns, and what kinds of things might you need to take into consideration before you get started warping and weaving on your loom. And then there are the sort of incidental technical glitches, like what happens when a warp thread breaks, or what happens when you're getting too much draw in, or what happens when you've got a loose warp thread. And those are probably the most common errors. They're also the easiest problems to fix. And many of the books I've seen out there talk about these for shaft looms, but not necessarily for a rigid heddle loom that has been direct warped like this one has. So I want to go into each of these in a little more detail. And I want to start first by looking at my yarn choices and talking about things I might have considered or maybe needed to consider a little longer before I dove in. So a reminder, all my weft yarns are hand spun yarns. So I have a hand spun, I think this is a merino and tencel blend. In other words, and if I remember correctly, it's about 50-50. So this is not going to have much stretch. It is also not going to shrink. It's not going to, it's probably not going to bloom very much because I spun it as singles with a fairly high twist. And it is, especially for one of my hand spun yarns, this is pretty even. There's minor variation in the circumference of the yarn. So for instance, there's a little bit of a slub here, but it's nothing major. My silk yarn, my golden silk yarn, also hand spun, is relatively consistent and it's fairly high twist. And because it's 100% silk, it might bloom a little bit, but it is not going to full the way a wool based yarn will. And there's some variation, but it's within reasonable limits. Like it looks like a hand spun yarn, but it doesn't look like, say, my very first ever hand spun yarn, which was so thick and thin. Uh, it it makes me laugh now, and in fact, I have kept it over the years. Now, my third hand spun yarn is a merino silk blend. So again, it's about 50-50. It is not going to change much in the wet finishing project, but this yarn, and I'm going to say by design, has significant variation. Those slubs are significant. And the reason this is important is any single time you are working with a highly textured yarn in your weft, it's going to affect your salvages. I feel you're never going to get super clean, super precise selvages when you're using a textured yarn. And so if you're making a fabric where super straight selvages, like a table runner or a shawl, will be noticeable and perceived as less than desirable, pick a different yarn. Use something more consistent. And my warp yarn was this commercial yarn, JoJo Land Remembrance, which I believe is no longer made. It is a delicious yarn. It's gorgeous. It is 2-ply. The plies are fairly high twist. Um, and my snap test, which I should have done but did not, meant I didn't know how it was going to act as a warp yarn under significant tension on a rigid heddle loom. Does this mean I shouldn't have used it? Probably not, but it would have been really smart for me to do a snap test before I went ahead and warped up my loom and got going with it. So, what's a snap test, you say? I have wrapped an end of this yarn around my finger, and I'm wrapping another end around another finger, and I'm keeping my hands, I'm going to say about 18 inches apart, and I'm just pulling on it. And if I do it again, and it snapped with some ease, like I didn't have to work hard at it. Let me show you a comparison with a silk yarn, and silk yarns are notoriously strong. They just don't. So it's not drifting apart, and you can see by the whites of my fingers that I'm really having to work to pull this yarn apart. And so, in retrospect, if I'd had enough of the yellow yarn, that might have made a better candidate. So, I'm going to bring this really close, um, even though this is a shorter length. So, this snaps maybe a touch too easily, and yet I chose it as my warp because I did not want, I had planned that this wrap was going to have a twisted fringe. And I know from experience that a slubby yarn in a twisted fringe can look kind of less than desirable to me. I like having really even yarns so that my fringe looks a certain way. So that was the first issue I encountered, was that if I wanted to use this JoJo Land Remembrance as my warp yarn, it might have been smarter for me to weave at, believe it or not, a lower tension, because the higher tension that I was working on was causing problems. And I tend to I like a really clean shed, especially when I'm using a stick shuttle. So I should have known, if I had done my snap test first, I would have known, okay, this yarn needs some gentle handling. Don't ratchet up the tension on the rigid heddle loom so hard that you have problems. And what do I mean by problems? I want you to look at, let's see if I can hone in on the exact bit I wanted. Okay, so for instance, and I left this in deliberately, see how this particular warp end has gotten really fuzzy? That's probably less to do with my tension and more to do with the fact that the yarn just had to go through slots and holes all day long while I was weaving. And in fact, this particular one, you can see it here, is going through a hole. So even though this is a really skinny yarn at a really wide set, I think that some of the abrasion of going through the holes led to some problems. But the much bigger problem that I encountered with this project, and this is the part I absolutely should have stopped and fixed when I first noticed it, was I was doing a new to me technique called clasped weft, where I wove part of the way across, or actually wove all the way across, looped a yarn around the yarn on my shuttle, then went back. And with that technique, though it produces really beautiful fabric, you can, if you're not paying super close attention to your selvages, you can get a significant amount of draw in. And in fact, I did notice this, but I didn't do the right thing. So you can see right here on my cloth beam, and I have put a small piece of corrugated cardboard in around my cloth beam so that the knots from tying onto the front apron bar wouldn't cause tension problems. So here's what the project looks like at the end. The cloth is close to 17 inches wide. And here's what it looked like when I started. It was closer to 18 inches wide. In other words, I allowed an inch of draw in to happen. And that, I think, caused the biggest problems with this warp yarn. So let's look at it from the back of the loom. I'm going to measure the width in reed at the back of the loom, and it's almost 19 inches. So the 18 inches I was getting when I first started weaving this project, that's pretty typical. That's kind of normal. But 2 inches in, disaster. And at the back beam, at the back beam and the warp beam, my width is coming in at 18.5 inches. So that was the single biggest problem. And I want you to notice this. See this? This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6 warp ends that broke as I was weaving because I had so much draw in. And on this side, I only had 2, but I still had 2. Now, I was lucky these were on the selvages and not in the middle of the weaving, because honestly, it's easier to recover from a broken salvage thread, or in my case, not do anything at all. I ended up just, I just kept on weaving. But that again is partly another reason why my fabric is so much narrower at the finishing end than at the beginning end.